The gate agent's voice cracked through the intercom like a gunshot. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you will not be boarding this flight." 300 people froze. Phones came up. And there she was, Deborah Ashcroft, president of the Meadowbrook Villas Homeowners Association, standing at gate C14 in her cream pantsuit, mascara starting to run, screaming at a 23-year-old gate agent like the poor kid had personally reprogrammed the entire aviation system just to ruin her vacation. "Do you know who I am?" she shrieked. "I built that community. Do you have any idea the lawsuits I could bring against this airline?" Behind her, in a wheelchair, sat a man named Walter Reyes. 61 years old, retired Marine, 2 prosthetic legs from an IED outside Fallujah, and the calmest expression you've ever seen on a human face. He wasn't smiling exactly. It was something better than a smile. It was the look of a man who had waited 11 months for this exact moment, and it had arrived right on schedule. Because 6 months earlier, this same woman had stood in front of an HOA board meeting, pointed a manicured finger at Walter's wheelchair, and told 40 of his neighbors that that thing was a liability, a trip hazard, and, in her words, frankly, an eyesore that doesn't belong in a community like ours. Now here she was. Grounded. Humiliated. Live-streamed. And about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet guy in the wheelchair. But to understand how we got here, to an airport, of all places, with an HOA president screaming into a microphone she didn't even have, we have to go back. Back to a cul-de-sac in Meadowbrook Villas, where this whole ridiculous, infuriating, ultimately satisfying story began. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we tell real stories about the everyday tyrants who think a laminated rulebook and a title like HOA president gives them the authority of a small nation-state, and what happens when they finally, gloriously, meet their match. Today's story has everything. A disabled veteran who just wanted to live in peace. A power-hungry HOA president who mistook a wheelchair ramp for a personal insult. Missing packages. Hidden cameras. A confrontation 18,000 feet in the air, well, almost in the air, which is kind of the whole point. And an ending so satisfying I had to fact-check it twice before believing it myself. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's talk about Walter Reyes, Deborah Ashcroft, and the day karma bought a first-class ticket. Walter Reyes moved into Meadowbrook Villas 3 years ago. It was supposed to be his forever home, a modest, single-story house with a wide garage he'd converted into a workshop, a small garden out back where he grew tomatoes he was way too proud of, and a quiet street where the loudest sound most evenings was the sprinklers kicking on at 6 p.m. Walter had served 2 tours. The second one ended the way too many second tours do, with a blast, a medevac helicopter, and 11 surgeries over the following 2 years. He came home with 2 prosthetic legs, a titanium rod in his spine, and a wheelchair he used on bad days, which, depending on the weather and how his back was feeling, could be 2 days a week or 6. He didn't talk about the war much. He talked about his tomatoes, and his late wife Carol, whose photo sat on his mantel next to a folded flag, and his dog Biscuit, an arthritis-riddled old beagle who'd somehow decided that Walter's lap was the only acceptable place in the universe to nap. The neighbors loved him. Genuinely. He waved at the mail carrier. He fixed Mrs. Pham's mailbox after a windstorm knocked it sideways. He kept an eye on the Delgado kids' basketball game from his porch and cheered louder than their own parents. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of neighbor an HOA should be thrilled to have. For 2.5 years, Meadowbrook Villas was peaceful. Walter had installed a small, tasteful wheelchair ramp at his front entrance, required by law, approved by the county, blending in almost seamlessly with the house's brick facade. It was maybe 4 feet wide. It didn't stick out into the sidewalk. It didn't block anyone's view. It was, in every legal and practical sense, none of anybody's business. And then Deborah Ashcroft won the HOA presidency by 14 votes in an election that, frankly, nobody else really wanted to run for. That's when the peace ended. If you've ever lived under an HOA, you know the type. Deborah Ashcroft wasn't just an HOA president, she was an institution. She'd been on the board in some capacity for 9 years, cycling through secretary, treasurer, vice president, and finally, president, like she was climbing a corporate ladder made entirely out of mailbox color regulations and lawn height ordinances. She measured grass with an actual ruler. She once sent a violation notice to a family because their Halloween inflatable was up 4 days before the community-approved decorating window. She had, on more than one occasion, been seen driving slowly through the neighborhood at 7 a.m. with a clipboard, like a general inspecting troops, except the troops were rose bushes and the war was entirely imaginary. But Deborah's real specialty, her true talent, was making rules feel personal. She didn't just enforce the HOA bylaws. She interpreted them, selectively, aggressively, and almost always in a way that happened to benefit whoever she liked and burden whoever she didn't. And for reasons nobody in the neighborhood could ever quite pin down, Deborah did not like Walter Reyes. Maybe it was that his ramp, code-compliant, subtle, entirely legal, didn't match the aesthetic vision she'd unilaterally decided the community needed. Maybe it was that Walter had, politely but firmly, declined to donate to her beautification fund the year before, a fund whose expenditures were never quite itemized. Maybe it was simply that Walter didn't flinch when she talked down to him, and people like Deborah tend to develop a special kind of resentment for the people who refuse to be intimidated. Whatever the reason, by the spring of that year, Deborah Ashcroft had made Walter Reyes her project. It started small, the way these things always do. A letter arrived in Walter's mailbox, HOA letterhead, Deborah's looping signature at the bottom, citing him for an unauthorized structural modification to the exterior of the property, referring to his wheelchair ramp. Never mind that the ramp had been approved by the county building department 18 months earlier, with paperwork Walter still had in a folder in his filing cabinet. Never mind that federal fair housing law protected exactly this kind of accessibility modification. Deborah didn't care about any of that. She wanted it gone, or at minimum, she wanted Walter to sit through a humiliating hearing to justify his own mobility device to a woman who parked in handicapped spots, just for a minute, more often than anyone cared to count. Walter, being Walter, didn't panic. He didn't argue on the doorstep. He simply replied by email, calmly, attaching the county approval documents and a brief, polite citation of the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provisions. He assumed that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, at the HOA's monthly board meeting, open to all residents, held in the clubhouse with the slightly too cold air conditioning and the folding chairs that never quite lined up, Deborah stood at the podium with a printed agenda and, unprompted, brought up safety concerns in our common walkways. She put a photo of Walter's ramp up on the projector. "I want to be very clear," she said, in that syrupy, faux-concerned voice people like her use right before they say something cruel, "this isn't personal. But that ramp juts into the walking path, and frankly, it's a trip hazard. We have children in this community. We have elderly residents. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that some accommodations be made a little more discreetly." 40-some neighbors sat in stunned silence. Walter, sitting in the third row in his wheelchair, because that day happened to be a bad day, said nothing for a long moment. Then he simply said, "Deborah, I measured it myself last week. It's 4 feet wide. Same as everyone else's front walk. And it's legally protected under federal law. You can look that up." "Well," Deborah said, with a tight little laugh, "we'll have our attorney look into it." There was no attorney. There never was. But the meeting ended with a formal warning letter mailed to Walter's house the following Monday, threatening HOA fines if the ramp wasn't brought into compliance within 60 days. It was baseless. It was almost certainly illegal for the HOA to even attempt. But it was also, Walter realized with a slow, sinking feeling, just the opening move. The first sign that something stranger was happening came about 2 weeks after that meeting. Walter's mail started disappearing. Not all of it, just certain pieces. A prescription refill that never showed up, which meant an anxious 3 days without his back medication until the pharmacy resent it. A package containing a replacement wheel bearing for his chair, tracked and confirmed delivered by the carrier, that simply wasn't there when he checked. A letter from the Veterans Affairs Office that arrived a full 10 days late, its envelope suspiciously creased, like it had been handled and set aside before finally reaching his box. Then it got stranger. Twice, Walter found his garden hose unraveled and dragged directly across his ramp, not just left messy, but deliberately laid so the water pooled right at the top of the incline, right where a wheelchair tire would catch it. Once, he found gravel scattered at the base of the ramp, the kind that could easily slip under a tire or a cane tip. None of it was catastrophic. None of it, on its own, was even provable as intentional. That was the insidious part. Every single incident had just enough plausible deniability behind it. The wind must have knocked it over, sprinklers must have washed the gravel down, maybe the mail carrier made a mistake, that Walter, a disciplined man who didn't like jumping to conclusions, spent weeks second-guessing himself. But Walter was also a man who'd spent 2 decades in the Marine Corps learning to trust his instincts when something felt off. And this felt off. So he did what any reasonable, methodical person would do. He started paying attention. Walter's neighbor, a retired police detective named Ruth Holloway who lived 2 doors down and had zero patience for HOA nonsense of any kind, was the one who suggested cameras. "You're not being paranoid," she told him over coffee one Tuesday morning, biscuits snoring at their feet. "You're being smart. If someone's messing with your property, you document it. That's it. That's the whole strategy." Walter installed 2 discrete weatherproof cameras, one aimed at his mailbox, one covering the ramp and front walk, the following weekend. Cheap enough not to break the bank, good enough to capture clear footage day or night. He didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood. He didn't post about it. He just quietly let them run. For 9 days, nothing happened. Walter almost started to think Ruth had talked him into being overly suspicious. On the 10th day, the mailbox camera caught it. A woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat and oversized sunglasses, an outfit that, frankly, fooled absolutely no one who'd lived on that street for more than a month, walked up to Walter's mailbox at 7:14 a.m., glanced left and right like she was in a spy film, and pulled out 3 envelopes. She tucked them into a tote bag and walked off, quick and purposeful, back toward a house 4 doors down. Deborah Ashcroft's house. The ramp camera, 2 days later, caught something even worse. Deborah, again in her not-so-clever disguise, dragging a garden hose across Walter's driveway at dusk, carefully arranging it so it crossed directly over the ramp's incline, then coiling it back up on her own side of the property line like nothing had happened. Walter sat in his living room, Biscuit's head resting on his prosthetic leg, and watched the footage 3 times. He wasn't angry, exactly. He felt something closer to relief, the specific, grim relief of a man who'd finally confirmed he wasn't losing his mind. Then he called Ruth. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to make some copies of this." Walter didn't confront Deborah immediately. He was patient, the same patience that had gotten him through 11 surgeries and 2 years of physical therapy. Instead, he built a file. Time-stamped video. Mail carrier statements confirming delivery of the missing prescription and package. A written log of every incident with dates. Copies of the baseless HOA warning letters. And, thanks to Ruth's old contacts, confirmation that intentionally tampering with someone's mail, even just removing it from a mailbox without authorization, was a federal offense. He brought all of it to the next HOA board meeting. The room was packed that night. Word had gotten around that Walter was planning to speak, and in a neighborhood starved for actual drama, that was basically a red carpet premiere. Deborah opened the meeting the way she always did, rattling off updates about mulch color standards and an upcoming curb appeal audit, completely unaware of what was coming. When public comment opened, Walter wheeled himself to the front. "I want to thank Deborah for her concern about safety hazards on my property," he began, calm as ever, "because it turns out there really has been a hazard on my property. I just found out who's responsible for it. He connected his laptop to the projector, the same projector Deborah had used months earlier to display his ramp like evidence in a trial. Up came the footage. The mailbox. The sun hat. The hose. The gravel. You could have heard a pin drop in that clubhouse. Deborah's face went through about 4 different colors in the space of 10 seconds. That footage is doctored, she stammered. That's an invasion of my privacy, you can't just. It's a camera pointed at my own mailbox and my own driveway, Walter said evenly. On my own property. I checked. That's not illegal. Tampering with someone's mail, though. That is. The board president, not Deborah, but the vice president, a mild-mannered accountant named Gerald who'd clearly been waiting a long time for a moment like this, cleared his throat and asked, in front of the entire room, Deborah, is that you in this video? Silence. Deborah, Gerald repeated, is that you? What happened next is the kind of thing that, if you'd written it into a movie script, people would say was too on the nose. Deborah stood up, gripping the podium so hard her knuckles went white, and unleashed what several neighbors later described as an unhinged, 10-minute rant about respect, about everything she'd sacrificed for this community, about how nobody appreciated her vision, and, bafflingly, about how Walter's wheelchair had started this whole mess by drawing attention to itself. The room did not react the way she expected. Mrs. Pham, whose mailbox Walter had fixed 2 summers earlier, stood up and said, loudly, you stole a veteran's medication. His medication, Deborah. The Delgado family, whose kids Walter cheered on from his porch, started recording on their phones. Someone near the back muttered, this is going on the neighborhood Facebook page tonight, and someone else, no one ever confirmed who, actually said, good. Gerald, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down, informed Deborah that under the circumstances, the board would need to hold an emergency session regarding her position, and that, given the footage, the mail tampering, and what was very obviously a pattern of retaliatory harassment against a resident with a documented disability, she should expect to hear from the HOA's actual attorney this time. A real one. Deborah stormed out of the clubhouse that night to a chorus of murmurs, a few muffled laughs, and at least one slow, ironic clap from a teenager sitting near the door. It was not the humiliation she'd end up remembering most, though. Not by a long shot. Because the board meeting was in March. And the real story, the one that ends at gate C14, happened 5 months later, in August, on a trip absolutely nobody saw coming. You'd think, after being caught red-handed on camera stealing a disabled veteran's mail, most people would slink off quietly and count themselves lucky the police weren't involved. Deborah Ashcroft was not most people. Removed from the HOA presidency by a unanimous emergency vote, formally warned by the postal inspector's office after Walter, reluctantly, but firmly, at Ruth's urging, filed a report, and now facing the very real possibility of a small claim suit over the missing prescription costs, Deborah did not go quietly. She went scorched earth. She started a petition, going door to door, trying to get neighbors to sign a complaint accusing Walter of harassment for installing surveillance equipment pointed at shared community spaces, conveniently omitting that the cameras were on his own property, pointed at his own driveway. Nobody signed it. Several people reported that Ruth Holloway, watching from her porch with her arms crossed, was enough to make Deborah cross to the other side of the street. She left 1-star reviews on a small hardware store's page after learning, incorrectly, that they'd sold Walter his cameras. She wrote a furious, rambling letter to the local newspaper about victim culture in modern HOAs, which the paper declined to publish, though a junior reporter did quietly reach out to Walter for comment, which is a whole other story. And then, in early August, in what can only be described as one of the strangest coincidences in the history of small-town pettiness, Deborah discovered that Walter had booked a flight to visit his daughter and new grandson in another state, and that, through the world's smallest violin of a scheduling accident, she and her husband had booked a flight on the very same airline, out of the very same regional airport, departing from the very same gate area, on the very same morning. She could have ignored it. She could have simply avoided him at the gate and let it go. Instead, apparently unable to resist one final act of petty cruelty, Deborah decided this was her chance for one last public humiliation, a farewell performance in front of an audience of strangers who had no idea about the mail, the hose, the gravel, or any of it. She just saw a man in a wheelchair, near a boarding line, and decided to make a scene. It started the way these things always start with someone like Deborah, loud, sudden, and completely disproportionate to the actual situation. Walter had wheeled himself up near the front of the boarding line, well within his rights as a passenger requesting pre-boarding assistance, chatting quietly with the gate agent about getting settled before the general boarding crowd came through. Deborah, spotting him from several rows back, apparently decided this was the moment. "Oh, of course," she announced, loud enough for the entire gate area to hear, "let's hold up the whole flight for the wheelchair." Again. Some of us have connections to make. The gate agent, a patient young woman named Priya who had, in fact, seen every possible variety of entitled traveler in her 3 years on the job, calmly informed Deborah that pre-boarding for passengers requiring mobility assistance was federal policy, not a personal favor, and that it typically added less than 90 seconds to the boarding process. Deborah did not accept this answer gracefully. She launched into a tirade, the exact same tirade, almost word for word, that half the gate area would later describe on social media, about special treatment, about everyone thinking they're disabled these days, about how, back in my day, people just walked it off. She got louder. She got closer to the counter. She reportedly grabbed at the boarding pass scanner at one point, insisting she and her husband be let through immediately, before this takes all day. And that, the grabbing, the shouting, the refusal to step back after being asked twice by airline staff, was the exact combination of behaviors that, on any commercial flight in the country, tends to trigger one very specific, very final response. Priya calmly picked up the gate phone, said a few quiet words, and within 90 seconds, 2 airport security officers were standing at the gate. Deborah, still mid-rant, didn't even notice them at first. She was too busy pointing at Walter's wheelchair, telling anyone who'd listen that it was a trip hazard blocking the jet bridge, that it shouldn't even be allowed on planes, completely unaware that half the gate area was now filming her, and that one of those people, a college student in a Buffalo Bills hoodie, happened to be a Meadowbrook Villas resident who recognized her instantly and was already texting the neighborhood group chat. The security officer's voice, when it finally cut through her rant, was calm, professional, and utterly final. "Ma'am, due to your behavior and refusal to comply with staff instructions, you will not be permitted to board this flight." Deborah's face went slack. "Excuse me? Do you know who I? Ma'am. I built that neighborhood association. I have platinum status with this airline. Ma'am, platinum status doesn't override federal boarding regulations. You'll need to step away from the gate." And there it was. The moment. Deborah Ashcroft, the woman who had spent months trying to convince an entire community that a legally protected wheelchair ramp was a public menace, being physically escorted away from a gate by security, in front of a crowd of strangers, while the trip hazard she'd complained about sat quietly a few feet away, having done absolutely nothing except exist. Walter didn't gloat. He didn't even say anything, at first. He just watched, with that same calm, almost tired expression, as 11 months of pettiness collapsed into one deeply, satisfyingly public consequence. Then, as Deborah was led past him, still sputtering about lawsuits, Walter finally spoke, quiet, even, not a trace of malice in it. "Deborah. For what it's worth, I hope you and your husband have a nice day." Someone in the crowd actually laughed out loud. The video, filmed by no fewer than 6 different passengers from 6 different angles, was online before Walter's flight had even finished boarding. By the time he landed and turned his phone back on, it had over 200,000 views. By the following week, it had cracked 2 million, picked up by several larger accounts with captions like HOA Karen gets denied boarding after harassing disabled veteran, and "This is the best kind of justice." Back in Meadowbrook Villas, the reaction was, unsurprisingly, seismic. The neighborhood Facebook group, usually reserved for lost cat posters and complaints about leaf blowers, exploded with comments. Neighbors who'd quietly disliked Deborah for years but never said anything finally spoke up. Mrs. Pham posted the mailbox story. The Delgado family posted a video of Walter cheering their kids on from his porch, captioned simply, "This is who Deborah tried to destroy." Absolutely not. The airline, for its part, issued a brief statement confirming that a passenger had been denied boarding due to disruptive behavior and non-compliance with crew instructions, which was corporate speak for exactly what everyone had already seen with their own eyes. Deborah, meanwhile, was formally removed from any remaining committee positions within the HOA. Gerald, now serving as full president, made sure of that within the week, and was quietly informed by the HOA's actual, real, hired attorney that Walter's small claims filing over the missing prescription and package, combined with the mail tampering report already on file with postal inspectors, put her in a legally precarious position that extensive public embarrassment was not going to help. She eventually agreed to a settlement, reimbursement for Walter's out-of-pocket medical costs, a written apology, read, at Walter's request, not by Deborah but by Gerald, at the next open board meeting, into the official minutes, and, perhaps most satisfying of all to the neighborhood at large, a formal, binding agreement that she would never again serve on the Meadowbrook Villas HOA board in any capacity. Walter didn't ask for any of it out of spite. When Ruth asked him, over coffee a few weeks later, whether the whole thing felt like a win, he just shrugged and scratched Biscuit behind the ears. "I didn't need her to lose," he said. "I just needed her to stop. Everything else was just extra." Here's the thing about people like Deborah Ashcroft. They mistake authority for power, and they mistake power for permission to humiliate, to harass, to decide who belongs and who doesn't, all while hiding behind a clipboard, a title, or a laminated rulebook nobody else bothered to read closely enough to challenge. But real power, the kind that actually holds up under pressure, doesn't come from a title. It comes from patience. From documentation. From refusing to let someone else's cruelty rush you into a reaction you'll regret. Walter never raised his voice. He never stooped to Deborah's level, not once, not even when she was stealing his medication or dragging a hose across his driveway hoping he'd fall. He just quietly gathered the truth and let it speak for itself, at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right people. And in the end, the very thing Deborah tried to weaponize against him, public attention, an audience, a stage, became the exact mechanism of her own undoing. She wanted everyone watching when she humiliated Walter one last time at that gate. She got her wish. She just didn't get the ending she was expecting. If there's one thing this whole story proves, it's this: dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. And karma, as it turns out, occasionally flies coach, right behind you, patiently waiting for boarding group 1. So that's the story of Walter Reyes, Deborah Ashcroft, and the day an HOA Karen got herself denied boarding in front of the very man she spent months trying to humiliate. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president, or honestly, anyone, who used a little bit of authority to become a whole lot of a problem? Did you document it? Did karma ever catch up to them the way it caught up to Deborah? Drop your story in the comments below. The wildest ones genuinely might end up as our next video. And if you enjoyed watching a self-important HOA tyrant get walked out of an airport gate in front of a live audience, you know exactly what to do: like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.